Good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Larkin, and I'm the director of the Latino Latin American Studies program here at St. John's St. Ben's. My computer screen just went blank. I'd like to welcome all of you to tonight's lecture on Mayan poetry and identity. But before we begin the lecture, I want to give you some information about the Latino Latin American Studies program here at the campuses. We do have a minor in Latino Latin American Studies. As you can see here, it consists of 5 classes, 2 of them in Hispanic Studies, and then 3 electives that you can take from a wide variety of courses in Hispanic Studies, history, global business, philosophy, and theology. If you are interested in adding a Latino Latin American Studies minor to your curriculum, I would love to speak with you. And so I'll be around after tonight's lecture and would be glad to speak with you or to set up an appointment to speak with you at some time in the future. Also, because it's almost registration time, I got to show you something else. Here's a look at the courses that Latino Latin American Studies is offering next semester, in which you can enroll. We have a wide variety. There's a course in art or art history that you can take. There are 2 courses in history, one lower division, one upper division, that you may take as well if you'd like. 2 courses in Hispanic Studies. And then finally, 2 courses in theology. These courses are also cross-listed. The first one is the course that I teach. It's also a history course. The second one is a course that Rebecca Buru Davis is teaching that also is a art course. So if you're interested, there's information both on the minor and on the courses being offered next semester on the table, and you can take one of those flyers on your way out. The last thing that I'd like to mention is that tonight is the second of the series that the Latino Latin American Studies program is sponsoring, the second of 3 lectures. One lecture has already passed that you can see up there. We have tonight's lecture as well, but you'll have an opportunity to attend another lecture sponsored by the Latino Latin American Studies program on 2 weeks from tonight, right here in Quad 264. All the lectures this semester are on the theme of Guatemala. And so I just wanted to point out that there is one more lecture coming up. I said that that was going to be the last one that I was going to do, but it's actually not. I have one more thing that I need to do, and that is to introduce the person who's going to introduce tonight's speaker. Jacob Schauback, who is a political science major and Hispanic Studies major, and is also participating in the Latino Latin American Studies Reading Circle this semester, which you can also, well, you can't do it anymore this semester, but in future semesters, because Latino Latin American Studies always has a lecture series, you can enroll in the Reading Circle for 0 or 1 credit and go to all the lectures and do some extra reading as well and talk with people who are interested in Latino Latin American Studies. Jacob is also participating in that Reading Circle this semester, and he has the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight.
Good evening, and thank you for coming to tonight's event. As Dr. Larkin said, I'm Jacob Schauback, and I have the distinct honor of introducing tonight's speaker. Emilio del Valle Escalante is Quiche Maya, originally from Momostenango, Guatemala. He's an associate professor in Romance Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His teaching and research focuses on contemporary Latin American literatures and cultural studies with a particular emphasis on indigenous literatures and social movements, and Central American literatures and cultures. His many publications include Maya Nationalisms and Post-Colonial Challenges in Guatemala, Coloniality, Modernity, and Identity Politics in both English and Spanish versions, an edited collection of essays entitled Theorizing Contemporary Indigenous Literatures, and an anthology of Maya poetry including 15 poets from 6 different Maya language communities. His current project is entitled Before and After Genocide in Guatemala, Rebuilding the Mayan World Through Literature. Tonight's talk is entitled Maya Literary Resurgence in Guatemala, Francisco Morales Santos and Luis de Leon. Please join me in extending a Benedictine welcome to Emilio de Valle Escalantes.
Well, thank you very much, Jacob, for that kind introduction. And thank you also to the Department of Hispanic Studies, as well as Latino and Latin American Studies, and to everyone who made my visit here possible, especially Roy, who picked me up from the airport and has been taking me all over the place, showing me around really wonderful places, and organized the poetry reading last night, which I had a really great time. And thank you to all of you who participated on that. So it's really nice to be here with all of you sharing my work. I really appreciate your invitation. So I'm going to be talking today about my current book project, which focuses on basically doing a genealogy of contemporary Maya literature since the 1960s up to 2012. And okay. Showtime, I guess. Okay, so for those of you who may not be familiar with Guatemala's recent history, the country experienced a civil war, right? Beginning with a grassroots popular response to a military dictatorship that established itself 6 years after a coup d'etat in 1954, the Guatemalan Civil War ran from 1960 to 1996. Within this context, a series of military governments trampled the human and civil rights of the majority of the population through repressive means. In the 1980s in particular, the Guatemalan army assumed almost absolute, almost absolute government power and resorted to military operations directed towards the physical annihilation of the opposition. These operations later turned into attacks against unarmed civilians, particularly indigenous Maya peasants from the rural areas of the country. During the war, 1.5 million people were displaced. Over 40,000 people were disappeared, and approximately 200,000 people were killed. With regards to the Maya population, and according to Truth Commission reports, most of these killings constituted acts of genocide. It is within this context that a contemporary Maya intelligentsia emerges, and it is today organized as a Pan-Maya movement that gained political visibility and prominence during the 1990s. The political efforts of the movement are oriented towards reclaiming indigenous rights, including the revitalization of 21 surviving Maya languages, Maya religion and spirituality, native knowledge, and a political social consciousness. Literature authored by contemporary Maya writers has been significant in this enterprise. Indeed, since 1961, we also see the resurgence of a modern Maya literary canon that complements, and it is organically tied to the Pan-Maya movement. So in my current book project, tentatively entitled Before and After Genocide in Guatemala, Rebuilding the Maya World Through Literature, I highlight 3 different historical moments during which Maya authors engage with the violent legacies of the military dictatorships, while elaborating a new poetics that aims to establish their distinct cultural and linguistic identity. The first moment dates back to the beginning of the war and examines the Guatemalan left's interest in incorporating the Maya population into the armed struggle. Here, non-indigenous intellectuals deal with the so-called Indian problem by responding to indigenous linguistic and cultural differences through strategies of cultural assimilation. Writers like Francisco Morales Santos and Luis de Leon contest these perspectives and through their literature propose to build a political space that embraces the socialist ideal of the left while affirming indigenous cultural specificities. The second moment occurs in the late 1980s, after the worst military repression against Mayas takes place in the country. Writers like Luis Enrique Sam Colop, Humberto Acabal, who is from my hometown, Momostenango, right to say that. Gaspar Pedro Gonzalez, who is Canjobal Maya, and Victor Montejo, who is Popti Maya, begin to question and to distance themselves from the socialist ideal and focus instead on dignifying indigenous languages, cultural specificities, religious and environmental values. They also criticize the violence and discrimination against Mayas. The third moment occurs after the war formally ends in 1996. Influenced by their predecessors and the new cultural phenomena of globalization occurring in the country, a generation of Maya writers emerges that includes Maya Kuchok, who's Quechí Maya, Rosa Chavez, who's Cachiquel Quiche, Pablo Garcia, Quiche Maya, and Manuel Tzoc, who's Quiche from Totonicapan, and Sabino Esteban Francisco, who's Maya Canjobal. These writers contest and/or continue the debate on Mayaness of their immediate predecessors by exploring new themes associated with the aftermath of the war, such as migration, gender, memory, and queerness. So, in this presentation, I will be offering a discussion of the first moment of literary Maya resurgence by discussing Francisco Morales Santos' poem, Volveremos, or We Will Be Cachiquel Again, and Luis de Leon's poetry book, Poemas del Volcán de Agua, Los Poemas Míos, or Poems from the Water Volcano, My Own Poems. I will argue that these Cachiquel authors and their works are responding to the so-called Indian question in Guatemala in order to challenge dominant visions of Maya cultural identity and history. In doing so, they propose to inscribe their experience through their own Maya nationalism. And as you can see, I'm putting like footnotes because I don't have time to go over everything. So I'm sure you got that, right? So let me begin with Francisco Morales Santos. Volveremos, or We Will Be Cachiquel Again, is a poem included in Morales Santos' first poetry book, Agua en el Silencio, Water in the Silence, published in 1961. In my view, the poem not only inaugurates a Maya literary resurgence that will find its prominence in the 1990s, but also represents the first literary political manifesto of the Pan-Maya movement in Guatemala. As we will see, the poem vindicates a millenarian Cachiquel Maya social and political consciousness with its own cultural specificities. In doing so, the poem articulates what Gerald Postema calls prophetic memory, by imagining a Maya future emancipated from the chains of colonialism. Let me cite the entire poem so I can offer a better critical analysis of it. Perhaps I can have a volunteer who can read the poem. Just one person, just one at a time. Just one? Volunteers? Okay? Thank you. Do you need my glasses? Or you want to come here? Okay. Which one? Cachiquel?
We will be Cachiquel again in the clearing of the destroyed temple, and we will come back blue from the green ocean, dragged by the brain and the lead weight of our children. We are below, in the shadow of a floral hymn that Cucumats safeguards, listening to the harang of the return in the swollen mouth of the monolith conqueror of time. In Tikal and Zaculeo, 100 flames of blood are pounding, and 100 palpitations are uniting us so that we build the temple of our people for every absent brother. We will return with tattooed arms through the furrows of the maize field in the smile of an ear of corn that will again conquer the naked heart. We will be Cachiquel again. Whistles, marimbas, chirimas, mais, tunes placed before the sun to warm up the song.
So, as we can see, the poem is structured in 5 stanzas written in free verse. It gives the impression that the poetic voice is walking in millenarian Maya cities like Tikal and Saculeu, 2 of the most important cities in Mesoamerica, occupied by the Itza and Mam populations since the pre-Columbian period. It also seems that the poetic voice acquires his creativity after observing the monolith conqueror of time, or Amala Stellae. In its 23 verses, the poem evokes a millenarian symbolic universe within a context marked by adversity. The cities and the indigenous world has been destroyed. The Kakchikal peoples find themselves below. Nevertheless, amid adversity, and from the destroyed temples emerges an emancipatory and political project. In the middle of the rainforest, safeguarded by Gukumats, or the plumed serpent, the Kakchikal plan their collective return. In Tikal and Saculeu, 100 flames of blood are pounding, and 100 palpitations are uniting this indigenous nation, which begins a journey towards reconstructing a new world. Through the anaphor, we will be Kakchikal again. The poetic voice affirms and celebrates the return with whistles, marimbas, chirimias, tunes, placed before the sun to warm up the song. The Kakchikal will again return blue from the green ocean to the maize fields, and with tattooed arms, dragged by the brain and the lead weight of their children to conquer the naked heart. So, the poem evokes significant epistemological references associated to the Maya world. For example, by indicating that the Kakchikal will again return blue from the ocean, the poetic voice reminisces the importance of pre-Columbian rituals of purification before a sacrifice. Blue is also the color directly associated to the rain god, Chak, and associated to rain and the corn harvest. And I include this image from Apocalypto, the true history of Mayan people. Have you seen it? This is actually one of the few things that Mel Gibson got right with the blue, as dressed in the blue, right? But yeah, blue is a very significant color. A lot of people that were sacrificed were painted blue in order to purify their bodies, right? So, the celebration of the return of the Kakchikal described by Morales Santos even reminds us of scenes of rebirth like the ones represented in the murals of Bonampak in Chiapas that include imagery of musicians with trumpets and zoomorphic masks against a blue background. Morales Santos' poem raises questions such as, why do the Kakchikal have to be Kakchikal again? What stops them from affirming their cultural and political identity within the context of Guatemala at this time? Why are the Kakchikal below, and why the necessity to build a temple of our people for every absent brother? Taking into consideration the social context in which the poem was written and published, and read as political theory, we can argue that We Will Be Kakchikal Again offers a response to the indigenista policies and discourses of the conservative and progressive Ladino or white elites of the epoch. And here let me make a brief parenthesis in order to indicate what indigenismo is. Indigenismo is basically the discourses or literatures or the art produced by non-indigenous peoples, but that talks about indigenous peoples. That is basically non-Indians talking about Indians. Miguel Ángel Asturias, in his novel Men of May is an example of it. The work of the muralistas in Mexico, Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, is also a representation of like indigenista art, right? Non-Indians talking about Indians, yeah? And so that's different from like indigenous literatures. By indigenous literatures, we're talking about literatures written by indigenous peoples talking about themselves, right? So my argument is then that Morales Santos is responding to indigenista policies, that is, non-Indians developing policies to solve the Indian problem, right? So those of you familiar with the country's history, especially with regards to interethnic relations in Guatemala during the 1950s, know that at the time the discussions and debates at the Guatemalan Congress dealt with how to incorporate indigenous peoples into society after a long period of political, cultural, and economic segregation under the regime of this man, Jorge Ubico. According to Claudia Dari, in 1945, various indigenista writers debated as to whether or not the new Republican Constitution should include special laws to protect and support indigenous populations. With the so-called October Revolution of 1944-1954, the regime of Juan José Arévalo and Jacobo Arbenz Guzmán developed a program of lawful modifications that included educational campaigns to teach Spanish. They prohibited forced labor and proposed a land reform policy to benefit peasants in the rural areas of the country. These two guys were very much influenced by the Mexican Revolution of 1910, the revolution that overthrew Porfirio Diaz, following similar legal stipulations in order to reform the Guatemalan Constitution, right? More conservative sectors, for their part, debated as to whether or not these policies would be effective. Instead, they proposed estatutos de tutela, or guardianship programs, that demanded that the Indian be civilized by, among other things, forcing them to speak Spanish instead of Maya languages, outlawing the use of traditional clothes, or traje, talking about the Kaqchikel peoples, these are Kaqchikel Maya women, and religious rituals which they saw as uncivilized. Moreover, they argued that implemented labor laws would mean leaving the country without a labor force. With the overthrow of the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz Guzmán in 1954, the military regimes that took power began anti-communist policies that limited the political proposals being debated in Congress. They reestablished policies of segregation that separated the Indian from the nation and ideas of Guatemalan citizenship. So what they basically decided is, as long as the Indian don't bother us with in the nation state, we're fine. Just leave them over there, right? In their world. We don't care. In any case, what is important to underscore in these processes and debates, whether they are progressive or conservative, is that they not only evidence strategies of Ladinization or the Indianization, but also that these were proposals emanating from the white and mestizo or Ladino elites that were worried about the political and socioeconomic situation of their societies and their immediate future, where the Indian was a sort of a thorn in their side. Contrary to these civilizatory perspectives, Morales Santos' poem announces the development of a Kaqchikel social consciousness to defend, dignify, and nurture the vindication of indigenous peoples' millenarian identities. Moreover, We Will Be Kaqchikel again proposes to rebuild the indigenous world and reconquer the naked heart, a metaphor that addresses the capitalist and mercantilist economic policies being adopted by the Guatemalan state at the time. Within a broader social internationalist context, Morales Santos' poem also can be placed in dialogue with debates and political struggles for indigenous rights occurring outside Guatemala. Indeed, We Will Be Kaqchikel again anticipates the indigenous literary and social movements in other parts of the Americas. For example, the rise of Indianismo through international indigenous summits in Barbados 1971 and 1978, where indigenous and non-indigenous intellectuals discussed alternative policies to recognize and materialize the rights of indigenous peoples. So Indianismo is a category that is going to emerge in Bolivia in the 1970s. We were having this discussion earlier, right, in one of the classes. It used to be used in the colonial period by, among others, Fray Bartolomé Las Casas, in the word Indianismo, to refer to indigenous peoples, right? But the same thing, indigenous peoples as a problem in the sense that they were not Catholic, they needed to be Christianized. But Indianismo, when we talk about Indianismo in the 1970s in Bolivia, is an indigenous movement reclaiming indigenous rights. So it's also different from indigenismo. Right? So Indianismo is going to emerge in Barbados in 1971 and 1978 in debates between indigenous and non-indigenous intellectuals discussing alternative policies to recognize and materialize the rights of indigenous peoples. The summits in Barbados, as many know, coincide and are related to other debates and political processes that emanate from dependency theory, liberation theology, internal colonialism theory, as well as the prominence of social movements toward the end of the 1970s. For example, the anti-colonial movements of negritude, feminism, the mothers of La Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, and the African-American, Chicano, and American Indian movements in the United States. The debates that transpire out of these struggles of these social movements, among other things, propose pan-ethnic categories that challenge colonialism and their epistemological legacies. With regards to the indigenous peoples, for example, we see activists and scholars challenging the category Indian for being a colonialist social construct that eclipses the ethnic, linguistic, and cultural diversity of indigenous peoples in the continent. Native intellectuals instead propose to be recognized based on their linguistic, cultural, and geopolitical millenarian origins, that is, as Aymara, Quechua, Quiche Maya, Navajo, Cherokee. In this sense, with reference to vindicating a Kaqchikel Maya identity, Morales Santos' poem can be inscribed within these debates, establishing and proposing his own political nationalist project. He centralizes the preoccupation of indigenous political affirmation from his Kaqchikel Maya perspective, negating the projects of assimilation of the non-indigenous elites who see and interpret indigenous peoples as a problem. How you doing? Okay, let's go on to Luis de Leon. Pretty good looking guy, right? He looks really mad. He has a reason to be mad. Okay, so a few weeks before his forced disappearance, on May 15, 1984, José Luis de León Díaz, better known by his pen name Luis de León, had placed many of his literary manuscripts in a small cartoon box. The box included, among other things, a novel, 3 collections of poetry, 3 collections of short stories, children's book, and a compilation of poems he had collected from his students after a literary workshop he created at the elementary school where he taught. Weeks before, through anonymous letters, León Díaz had received death threats. One day during those weeks, he told his wife, Maria Tula, that if something were to happen to him, she should take the small box with his writings to the Kaqchikel poet and friend, Francisco Morales Santos. He would know what to do with his manuscripts. On May 15, León Díaz left his home in the community of San Juan del Obispo to go to Guatemala City, where he was to meet with members of the Guatemalan Workers' Party, the country's Communist Party. He did not return home. Nor did we know about his whereabouts until 1999, 3 years after the signing of the peace accords that would formally end the 36-year armed conflict in Guatemala. As part of the processes of reconciliation of the peace accords, the Guatemalan army and the police force had to make public much of the records compiled during the Dirty War. Among these documents, there was a report from the police force that included a list with 135 names and photographs of people who had been detained and disappeared during the month of May in 1984. In that report, León Díaz appears under the number 135. The information included in this document states that 3 days after he was captured, the code 300 was applied to him. This code, the code 300, basically means executed. We owe the existence of Luis de Leon's literature in great measure to the labor of his wife Maria Tula and his friend Morales Santos. This literature is a lived testimony of an epoch full of uncertainty, but at the same time full of hope for many Maya and non-Maya intellectuals and people who bet on the armed struggle and the socialist utopia as a political alternative. Read against this context, Leon's works and his own life experience are representative of a literature of resistance. In this section, I will explore his collection of poetry, Poemas del Volcán de Agua, Los Poemas Míos. I will argue that Leon, similar to Morales Santos' project, inscribes an indigenous revolutionary consciousness within debates about the so-called Indian problem that is being debated in Guatemala at the time. As I will argue, Leon proposes a utopic revolutionary indigenous project that will eventually change the conditions of existence of the indigenous peasantry in his community of San Juan del Obispo. So this poetry book, Poemas del Volcán de Agua, was set in the second half of the 1970s and in the early 1980s. It is a poetry book that includes 14 poems written in free verse and in a vernacular language. The poetry book can be read as a Bildungsroman that, through the metaphor of childhood, allegorizes a process of raising consciousness of the poetic voice and the community of San Juan del Obispo. The book centralizes 3 moments in the development of this political consciousness. The first one, through personification, Leon characterizes the community of San Juan del Obispo as ingenious and alienated. Speaking in the third person, the poem titled Poem for the Water Volcano, for the Water Volcano's Child, that opens the book. He tells us that San Juan is the son of the volcano. He is someone that is just now becoming an adult. San Juan is over 400 years old. He's dark-skinned, peaceful, and sweet. He's a worker, semi-indigenous, semi-illiterate, and semi-ingenious. San Juan plants hope, but he only harvests grief. Since he adopted Christian values, he now believes that there is no possibility of redemption on earth, but that redemption can be found only in heaven. While this description seems to suggest a lack of hope with the use of ellipses, the poem anticipates a nationalist revolutionary change. This is San Juan del Obispo, the community. And behind that's the water volcano, okay? So this is what he's going to say in order to conclude his poem. Now San Juan still has a piece of land under his feet, but tomorrow, well, pretty soon everything will be the color of this flag. As is evident, the existence of an established mercantilist system coupled with a Christian ideology threatens to bring the plundering of territory. While on the one hand, the hegemonic system has alienated people through their exploitative material conditions of existence under which they live, the coming of change is also suggested. Pretty soon, everything will be the color of this flag. Leon allegorizes this revolutionary coming through the second moment in the collection of poetry, with the pregnancy of a mother. Here, the poetic voice imagines himself in and speaks from the mother's womb. We move from the third to the first person. The poetic voice evokes a primordial origin and a harmonic world without contradictions. In his poem to My Heaven, and the poem My Home, which is dedicated to Maria Venancia, the author's mother, the poetic voice speaks of being protected, of being safe from capitalist exploitation. In his mother's womb, he navigates happily like a fish in the middle of the water. There, in his mother's womb, the air is soft, there is no hurricanes, no storms, no dust, no garbage. It was the air of a country without deforestation. In his home, the poetic voice is exposed to a blue heaven made of flesh, where there is only an enduring sun with no winter, with no winter, with no summer, with no fall. There is only an eternal spring. He sees hundreds of birds fly over that heaven, the leaves of trees falling, butterflies, kites, stars, and fireworks. As the fetus grows in the mother's womb, he begins to realize that in order for him to live in that paradise, the owner of the house, that is his mother, has to work really, really hard. Consequently, the child gets ready to leave his house and to come out into the world. While in his mother's womb the poetic voice felt safe from capitalist exploitation, once he is in this world, the child becomes a slave. In his forehead, he carries the marks of the leather strap for carrying bundles of wood, like a mark of livestock. As soon as the day begins, he gets up and runs behind the shadow of his mother to go to work in the water volcano. In the afternoon, after they work in the water volcano, both of them descend like two beasts of burden. She flattened under the weight of a big basket. He bent under the weight of a heavy bundle. Little by little, the boy begins to realize the contradictions and changes that are occurring in his community. In the poem To My Kite, the poetic voice speaks of how he flies his kite over the green fields amid birds and pine trees. His happiness, however, turns into sadness, since the place where he flies his kite and others where the children play have been restricted due to the privatization of land. When the kids complain about this to the elders of the community, the boy learns from them that this has been happening in other regions of the country, they tell him. The land is being divided. The elders also talk about a history of shame and plundering. One day, the poetic voice tells us, this boy will stop being a boy and a peasant, and he will rise up like a tree. So, the social and imaginary construction that Leon develops with the imagery of childhood and the consciousness raising of the poetic voice acquires a significant cultural and political dimension. The evocation of aquatic imagery and the image of the mother's pregnancy that we obtain can be associated to the water volcano. That is, the pregnancy symbolizes the volcano and the poetic voice speaks from within it. This allows the poet to develop a strong connection to the land in order to legitimize his authority as a narrator and a direct descendant of his community. Read from this perspective, the reference to the pregnancy, the mother's womb, and the birth of the boy can be associated to the idea of the cave and the origins of Mesoamerican civilizations. According to Stanislaw Chadwick, Tulancinsuan, the place of the 7 caves from where the diverse Mesoamerican peoples emerged, is located in the mountains and volcanoes. That is, caves for Mesoamerican religions are interpreted as the womb of the Mother Earth, the symbol of origins. Caves, for example, for the Mayans and the Aztecs are the entrance and exit to the underworld. The underworld, in turn, is the place where humanity and the universe originate. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiché Maya, Xibalbá, or the place of fear, is where the divine twin brothers Hunahpu and Ixpalamquej go in order to plant the first seed of corn after they defeat the Lords of Death. After this event occurs, humanity is made of corn and a new and harmonic order is established. For the Aztecs, Mictlan, the place of death, represents the underworld. It is where Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent deity, goes and finds jade bones. Do you know the story of Quetzalcoatl going into the underworld? This is fun. Okay, so he goes into the underworld, or Mictlan, and he finds jade bones. And you know what he does next? He's going to bleed his penis, and he's going to spread blood over the jade bones, and that's how we humans come to life. And then he sends ants to get corn in order to feed humanity. Pretty fun story, huh? Anyways, so the idea of the cave is also represented in Mesoamerican temples such as Palenque, or Tikal, or Chichen Itza. In their architectonic structure, these temples emulate and display similarities to volcanoes and mountains. The doors on the very top of these temples, as we can see, you can see these doors, right? They symbolize the entrance or exit to the place of origins, that is caves. And they symbolize rebirth, right? So today, caves and cenotes, or water deposits or small lakes, are the places where Maya and Nahua priests gather together to perform religious ceremonies for spiritual renovation. Coming out of a cave, in this sense, acquires a symbolic and religious significance associated to rebirth, recreation, and renovation. These ideas can be associated to Leon's poetry book with the birth of the boy and the revolutionary ideals to recreate a new world divorced from capitalism. In fact, this hypothesis becomes more convincing when we make reference to other texts authored by Leon where he explored similar themes. He also wrote a novel called Time Commences in Xibalbá, which is actually the first novel written by a Maya author. So as you can see, Time Commences in Xibalbá. The book is actually challenging other narratives of creation. For Leon, time and the existence, the creation of the people doesn't begin with the Bible or any other narrative of creation, but rather it begins in Xibalbá. He's making a reference to the Popol Vuh, right? So similar to the novel Poemas del Volcán de Agua, with the birth of the boy and his political consciousness raising, suggests a new political project that aims to socially and politically vindicate an indigenous peasantry, particularly from San Juan del Obispo. To the representation of the volcano in childhood, Leon resignifies the idea of the Mesoamerican cave in order to propose an alternative political and nationalist project founded on the Maya cosmovision, represented in much of Mesoamerican textualities. He develops a critique of and resistance to a capitalist system and the colonial legacy inherited from Roman Christianity, and instead proposes to rescue elements from his millenarian past in the reconstruction of a new society based on his own Maya cultural specificities. And by doing this, De Leon is then challenging the so-called Indian problem, right? In the sense that, as I said in the beginning, non-Indians see us as a problem because we speak a different language, because we dress differently, basically because we're different. So we have to be civilized. De Leon is, on the other, contrary to that perspective, what De Leon is saying, no, we're proud of being Mayas. We have a long millenarian history, and we need to rescue and reaffirm that history in order to be ourselves, okay? So that's it. Maltiosh Chechalak. Thank you so much.
Time for questions.
So this novel was translated into English in a couple of years ago. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. But it was originally written in Spanish, but the English translation is pretty good, in case you would like to adopt it too for one of your classes. It was written between 1970 and 1972, but it was actually published in 1985, since he was disappeared in 1984 and everything. But it was published in 1985.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, it seems like the poems for both authors and the novel were first written in Spanish rather than in editions like
Correct.
what does that signify for the resurgence of Mayan identity?
Mm-hmm.
And also, I'm just curious, how widely known were these authors in their time and afterwards and whatnot?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. if you have been in Xela, for instance, you will find out that obviously the majority of the population in Xela is Quiche Maya. But because of the policies of education, internal colonialism, over 60% of the population in Xela has lost the language, right? And the same has happened in other parts of the world, especially in San Juan Zacatepeque, San Juan del Obispo. The idea, because a lot of parents, the idea was, in order to be successful in society, you have to learn Spanish. And a lot of parents consciously didn't teach their kids indigenous languages. Luis de Leon and Francisco Morales Santos are two writers that didn't speak the Kaqchikel language. They spoke a little bit, but they received an education that's instruct them in Spanish and didn't teach them Kaqchikel language. And that's the experience today, even like in places like Guatemala City and other places in Guatemala where a lot of kids go to school, and we still find a lot of stereotypes in books that basically denigrate our history, our identity, and that's why you see a lot of people changing their names sometimes. And one of the things that the Pangmaya movement is trying to do is basically change those type of attitudes in order to say, literature in this sense is trying to say, hey, we have to feel proud of that history. I mean, it's a history that has thousands of years. And that's the role of literature, right? Like to dignify that identity. And what was the other question?
How widely known were these authors within Guatemala in their time and later on?
Because the Civil War has just begun, a lot of this literature was spread just among small circles. It was ¿cómo se dice? Declamada, performed. Yeah, it was performed among small groups in communities in order to sort of like dignify people, but it wasn't published. Like, you know, with De Leon, he wrote this a lot of his literature wasn't published until he was disappeared in 1985, but it didn't have wide circulation during the time. Like Morales Santos, his first book, he only published like 300 copies, and they weren't widely distributed. So this literature, in that sense, is for a small audience. And as you can see, since it was written in Spanish, it's mostly directed to non-indigenous peoples because, according to Leon and Morales Santos, they are the ones who need to know about this. They are the ones that need to be challenged in order to change their minds, right?
Is it possible that you summarize the relationship between the Popol Vuh and Mayan literature? Is it possible
Yeah.
to read Mayan literature without having read it before? If you were to teach a unit only on Guatemalan or Mayan literature?
Right. The Popol Vuh is fundamental. It's like one of the texts that, if you're to read like contemporary Maya literature in Guatemala, you have to know the Popol Vuh. It's like it's everywhere, you know. So it's an important text, so yes, it's and not for everyone because a lot of new authors, like the new generation, for instance, they address the Popol Vuh, but not as much. Like the first and second generation of Maya writers, like Luis de Leon and the other writers that I discussed, the Popol Vuh is extremely important. It's a reference all over in their works. With the new generation, like the younger poets, they are more atrevidos, more, ¿cómo se dice atrevidos? Daring, yeah. Like I have one of the chapters in my book that I called Mayas Come Out of the Closet, that focuses on Manu Tzok. He's homosexual and he's a transvestite. So his poetry talks about that experience, being rejected in his community for being gay, and he was beaten in Guatemala City one time because he was dressed as a woman, you know. But his poetry talks about that. And when you read his work, you feel so uncomfortable because he's so graphic with what he says about his sexuality, and you feel so uncomfortable. But he does that with a purpose, right? He wants us to feel what he's feeling, you know, feeling uncomfortable with with yourself, right? When you're discriminated against. And but yeah, so for the new generation, I would say it's important to also know the Popol Vuh. But for some authors, they wanna create something new, right? But yeah, it's I would say, like, if you wanna understand most of the literature, contemporary Maya literature, the Popol Vuh is fundamental. Yeah. Yes.
I have more like a background question about like the U.S. involvement. Was it because of the U.S. involvement that kind of sparked the military power to have like dictatorships following after it, in like the 1950s or something like that?
Yes.
So that they in some way kind of supported it, but they didn't really realize that it would lead to that.
Yeah. Well, the story is like Jacobo Arbenz Guzman promoted a land reform in the 1950s after he was elected president. And there was this U.S. company, the United Fruit Company, right? And the investors, two of the major investors for that company were the brother Dulles, John Foster Dulles, and what was the name of the other one? Alan Dulles. One of them was the director of the CIA at the time, and the other one was the Secretary of State, okay? So when they saw that Arbenz had proposed taking away land from the United Fruit Company, they advised the then president of the United States, I think it was Johnson, that Arbenz was a communist. So they invented this conspiracy. And then they supported an ex-military guy who was in exile in Honduras to go, they gave him logistics and money to go into Guatemala and overthrow Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. And what Castillo Armas did after that was to do like an anti-communist, una cacería anticomunista, ¿cómo se dice? Anti-communist hunt. So a lot of intellectuals went into exile, they were incarcerated, a lot of people were killed, and it created a lot of tension in Guatemala, and which eventually led in 1960 to, the armed struggle. So a lot of people said, hey, we are against the Guatemalan government and U.S. imperialism. That was the motto of the revolutionary movement. And that's what began the war in Guatemala, which unfortunately was supported by the United States, even today. In 1999, for example, Bill Clinton went to Guatemala and apologized to Guatemalans for the U.S. involvement in the war. But yes, so... and they knew, like under Reagan also, they knew that all these massacres were occurring against the Maya population. So, but I'm glad that the United States is not doing anything like that anymore. So, and it's also important to make a difference between the policies of the U.S. government and the people, because there were a lot of people that were making phone calls at the time saying, hey, we don't want the U.S. getting involved in Central America, because it wasn't just happening in Guatemala, it was occurring in other places. So, and you can see that. There is also sectors in the United States that oppose those type of policies, right? The war in Iraq, Occupy Wall Street. You remember those guys? Occupy Wall Street? Nice. So, good question. See.
Are we seeing these same types of themes in the Mayan Renaissance and the more modern writers from the 2000s?
Yeah, so we're different, like really new and exciting things. Like we have feminists, like Maya Ku is a feminist, and he challenges writers like De Leon, Morales Santos, because they are, what she's saying is like, you guys are just thinking about Maya subjects, hombres Mayas, right? The idea of the masculine Maya subject. And what about women? The idea of women for you is like the mother who just gives birth to a revolutionary, or like the woman who, because Morales Santos also has a poem dedicated to his mother, and she's like the peasant woman who takes care of, fights for his kid and everything, which is a beautiful poem. But Maya says, no, we're not just that. We are also activists, and she's fighting. Her poetry is like about Maya women's rights. And then you have Manu Tzok, who is writing, about his sexual identity, and other people who are writing about post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the case of Sabino Esteban Francisco, right? His poetry talks about that experience, that traumatic experience of being persecuted. So you see all this. It's a very heterogeneous, very diverse in terms of themes and topics. What these guys discuss in their works. But yeah, it's like to talk about Maya literature, you have to think about discursive differences. It's like when you talk about Latin American literature. I mean, to talk about Borges and to talk about Huidobro is very different, right? So similar with the Mayan canon.
Just a little follow-up from Brian's earlier question. So Luis de Leon and Francisco Moya Santos more writing in Spanish. Can you talk a little bit about some of the later writers, and many of them, are they writing in my languages in Spanish, and say a little bit about what that looks like now and sort of like their readership?
So yeah, like the second generation is the one that uses more like an essentialist type of approach, in the sense that they develop this idea of Mayaness that is very romantic. They also produce their work in Maya languages and in bilingual editions, Maya languages and Spanish, okay? And and my argument, at least in the book, is that they do this because when you see it's like, well, we cannot do this, right? Like, we cannot, because they are saying we have to go back to the past, okay? That kind of argument. So the reason why they're doing that is because between 1978 and 1982, that was when the government and the Guatemalan army went into communities and just began to kill a lot of people. So I read their poetry as saying, hey, look, you couldn't kill us. We still speak our languages. Our Maya identity hasn't been changed. We speak our languages. We practice Maya religion. We do ceremonies. All that kind of stuff, right? And that's what they say. And in my view, that's the response to say, hey, look, screw you. You couldn't get rid of us. We're still here. And our identity is still intact. So, and that's what they're doing in my view, with their literature.
I think this is fascinating, a very much needed field for research. As a European, when I was listening to you talk about the mythology, the Maya mythology, so fascinating. I wonder if there's some studies that work on relationships between Homer's mythology, for instance, and the Mayan mythology, because when you were talking about these characters that go into the underworld, I think of Andromeda, the character of Andromeda, Orpheus, that go to the underworld, and there's some similarities there. These things are absolutely fascinating because they dig into our subconsciousness. So to speak.
Right.
Are you familiar with any of this?
There are a few studies that sort of develop that comparison. Carlos Lopez has a book called The Popol Vuh and El Popol Vuh y sus epistemologías, and he draws some differences to Greek mythology. Mary H. Bruce also has a book on the hero twins, relating the hero twins with narratives like Homer's La Odisea, the Odyssey. And Dennis Stedlock also in his book 2000 Years of Maya Literature draws some similarities between the Greek and the Romans and Mayan mythology.
Probably also Joseph Campbell, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
This is
true.
fascinating. Thank you. You you have this published in the anthology, or is this an
These
extra?
poems, no, because I like to surprise.
Your paper,
I like to surprise my audience.
Your paper, the talk that you just gave.
Well, this is like the first chapter. It's more because I also argue that with the Leon and the like his poetry book is also responding to another writer from the 19th century in Guatemala, ¿cómo se llama? Who also wrote a poem to the water volcano. But his poem is comparing the water volcano to some mountains in Europe. I don't remember where. But so I'm arguing that the reason why Leon writes my own poems is just to suggest his own authority, that his poems are for, coming from the son, the true son of San Juan del Obispo. So, thank you so much. Sure, thank you. Thank you so much, you guys. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful.